Hey, what's going on, everybody? Today we're going to do a quick stream and talk about how I made the cinematic sound of the most recent track called Stand, which is a piece that was composed for the protesters at Standing Rock. You can go check it out on another video on the channel, listen to the whole track. Also, if you purchase the track, all of the proceeds will go directly to the cause, Stand with Standing Rock. But yeah, I figured I'd just go through how we got the really cinematic sound of the piece. So let's just dive in really quick. There's kind of four main parts to the piece that you can see here. Definitely this first section is the introduction, and you can see that it slowly builds, and that's definitely demonstrated through the amount of tracks as it goes on. It sort of builds up. Next section is sort of like the middle build section, or it's not really a build, it's sort of like it would be a verse in a typical song, sort of verse. And then this longer section is the real dramatic section. This is kind of the pinnacle of the piece. You can see that it's most thickly orchestrated. Most is going on there. And then the end, which is of course the outro. If you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to jump in the live chat, and I'll try to answer as many questions as possible. For now, let's just take a look at the intro. Right there. So I was originally inspired by the movie Arrival for this piece. And that incorporated a lot of droning electronic elements with cinematic elements. And that's kind of what I was going for here. So the first 4 bars were actually added in after I came up with the initial idea. And this all started in session view, which you can see here, with really just one scene. So that's just one simple MIDI drone going there on an instrument, that bass line, steady one note bass line, and then the strings. And that's kind of what this track was built around, this initial intro. Then I went ahead and added these 4 bars at the beginning to kind of set things up instead of jumping right in with a dramatic like string orchestra. So first 4 bars are like this. And that just kind of sets this tone. This instrument right here is from a pack on Ableton's site, but I just love the sound of it with the female voice. And then if you bring it even lower, it's got this really low synth sound as well. It's from a pack called Little People, so you should definitely look it up. It's filled with like samples from kids' toys, voices, and things like that, but I use this instrument all the time. Yeah, so that's kind of throughout the whole piece, and it drones on. Then we have this sort of standard synth bass sound happening. That kind of gives us a pulse. And then the reverb gives it a little bit of an extra cinematic taste, you know? And it does sort of evolve over time. It wanes in and out with the filtering. You can see this EFX knob is automated. So it's not just like a stagnant bass drone that's happening throughout the piece. There is some shape to it in most sections. These drums are a little weird. This is also from the Little People pack, I believe. Other than that strike. But those 2 blips and the clicks, as you can hear, like they're kind of like these plasticky sounds. And that's another example of like taken from kid instrument samples kind of thing. But that kind of just adds to the ambiance, and of course they have delay on them, which gives it a nice spacey feel. Yeah. Alright, let's check that out. It almost gives it like an alien sort of creepy vibe. And then the strikes, of course. This is about to come in. Slowly creeping in. Pad sound. This is an Ableton preset that's sort of been edited. And as you can see, the cutoff is shaped. So it doesn't just come in and be stagnant. It's got this sort of build effect to it. And then you add it in with everything else. And it's just a nice layer. We'll talk about the strings for a second because I use a lot of the same techniques for the strings throughout the piece. So let's look at this MIDI track. You can see that it definitely builds up as we go. So we start with just 1 line, 2 lines, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that really creates a nice cinematic build. Let's hear how that sounds. I mean, and that against the vocal sound of the first track up there, it just totally blends like in a really pleasing way, I think. So this string section is kind of setting up our harmonic progression. And they're sort of built in this clustery way where the notes are really close to each other. And then a higher note will creep in. But they're just really like long tones. They set the vibe. We add in another tone there which creates a little bit of tension, but not quite tension. And that's sort of resolved, but that top note tells us that we still have somewhere to go. And this is sort of what I call like the Law and Order technique, where if you've ever seen an episode of Law and Order, you know it's got that string music in it that kind of builds suspense through a scene. And really all it is laying down on a note. Like if you see this note here, that's our root note, and that stays throughout the whole piece. Same thing with that second note. And if you just kind of lay on the notes and slowly change and slowly add things, like this was a clear change right here. And then as the higher notes sort of drift in, it becomes more, but that drone at the bottom is still happening, which gives us a foundation. Yeah, one thing I noticed about Ableton strings is I always like to give them a boost on the high end. So as you can see on my EQ, they've got that boost up there, or else they're just really like rounded, soft tones. And I really like a more crisp sound, so I always boost the highs there. And the melody is being kind of played on the cello. And I could have had that added into the string ensemble, but I like them being separate things, especially for something like a solo line, because you can isolate it, you can make it a little bit louder in the mix, you can EQ it a little differently. This has a little bit of a different reverb on it that makes it even more crisp than I made the strings, but it still kind of sits in there like it's part of this section. One more sound I'll talk about in this section. Actually, yeah, before I go on, if you hear the cello being doubled, that's because it is, and it's being doubled on a higher string instrument, I believe. It's being doubled there on the French horn. I love to double melodic lines on a couple different instruments, and even doubling it on an instrument like the violin that's an octave up creates a little bit more of a dramatic effect. If you notice, some of my instruments are panned in different directions, especially the strings. and some of the horns to create that orchestral section vibe. Because if you were sitting listening to an orchestra, not everything is happening in the direct center. A lot of things are happening to your left or to your right, and that's just a natural thing happening because the position the orchestra is sitting in. So if you can emulate that in your mix, it kind of makes it a more real sounding recording. One more sound I'll talk about before we go on is this guitar sound that I found, which is one of Ableton's guitars. I just love that swell. To me, that is discernible from a... It's not discernible, I mean, from a real guitar. And I love making it swell like that. The more you can do with pitch and bending pitch with an instrument is the more real it's going to sound, because we're so used to plunking away notes on a controller, where like on a real instrument or real guitar, I can take it and I can bend the strings, and that's a very human thing. So adding that makes it definitely sound a little bit more real. Alright, we'll go in and talk about the next section now. That's the introduction. So that whole introduction is about 28 bars. Now let's go into the second section. Good morning, Ultrafags. How's it going, Micah? It's kind of afternoon now, but that's okay. Yeah, so when I first created the introduction to the piece, like, I get really stuck on pieces sometimes, and I'll be like, wow, that beginning was really great. I don't want to bring it down. I don't want to kill the energy of the piece, because this is such a strong section right here. And it's building, and it's building, and it's building. And then I just decided, you know, let's just bring it down, because we created this drama. Now let's let it settle in. And it does that. And the transition is helped a lot by the timpani, which is Live's timpani from Orchestral Percussion. And what I like to do is I'll play drum rolls either on push, on my root note, either on push or on a keyboard. And I won't quantize them usually, because it sounds a little bit more human. Well, it definitely sounds more human to not quantize. And it just sounds like I've naturally rolled them. You can hear that voice happening again, but this time it's in just one note in a higher space, and it makes it a little bit more delicate, which matches the section. And of course we added piano in this section, which, if you notice, are taken from the strings. So it's not everything in this section is new, it's actually just sort of reorchestrated to be piano. And if you notice, this isn't all perfectly quantized either, which is another part of getting a real cinematic human sound. This second chord is almost rolled into here, and that's basically just because this note isn't quantized. But that's something that you don't get if you just hit, you know, Command U and it's all lined up to the grid. But yeah, that section, as you can see, I split it in half, so it loops, sort of, without the higher notes. Is just taken from the strings, and it's the same cluster chords, and on piano they just sound really beautiful, I think. This Dreamer synth is kind of here and settled in. Let's hear what that sounds like. Real, just like straight up pad sound, which is almost like an 80s style pad sound that I wouldn't normally use, but when you put it against everything else, it creates a nice atmosphere. Hey, everybody, give it up for Chris in the house. What's going on, Chris? Yeah, and we do have... So just like before, if you notice, some of these sections have clips from other instruments in them, but like say this is a flute track, right? And that's got the cello in it. I want to carry some of the same melodic elements throughout the tune. So if I mess around, transpose down a couple octaves or up a couple octaves from the cello, I have this melodic element that was taken from earlier that's sort of thematic now. And it carries through. So even though the section is totally different, it's got some carryovers from the previous section. Hey, what's going on, Launchpadder? And then that also becomes passed to the French horn. And I find that passing around different melodies throughout the orchestra is a good way to make it sound a little bit more real, because that happens in a lot of regular orchestra music. And you can even see that that's sort of the same line from before. It's just doubled. And against the flute, it really fills out the sound. Then those two drop out with the melody totally, and we come in with the oboe, which is one of live's best orchestral sounds, I think. And of course we have the clarinet playing some notes throughout, which is sort of a call and response. Yeah. Usually my sets are a little bit more organized, but I kind of composed this piece in under 12 hours, and I wanted to get it out on Thanksgiving Day because I thought that was important, so it's really totally unorganized. But yeah, this oboe sound, and you might be noticing that a lot of the sounds have reverb on them, but if you notice in the effects chain, the reverb is all the way down. For some of this orchestral music, unless something needs its own special touch of reverb, then I'll go in the master channel and I'll add a reverb to the whole piece. Because, like, again, it just comes back to if you go and you view a whole orchestra playing, it's not like every instrument is EQ'd, every instrument is in its own space. They're all in the same hall. So you want to recreate that kind of hall sound, like I'm sitting in Symphony Hall listening to the orchestra play. So the reverb should be on the whole channel, like the whole orchestra. Oh, let's unsolo that. And the crotale is playing this simple. Oh, this is actually a glockenspiel in this section. I use this a lot. I've used it in a couple of other pieces, this technique. Oh, see you later, Ultrafags. Thanks for coming in and watching. Hey, thanks, Launchpadder, about the melody. I think I usually think more in terms of melody than anything, so I definitely put a lot into my melodies, and also being a songwriter, a singer and a songwriter, it makes you think about melodies a little bit differently. So I think of my melodies as, could they be sung? Could there be words to them? Just because that's my natural instrument, you know? But I just find having this simple glockenspiel line keeps everything moving in an otherwise very, very slow section. Okay, we have the handoff to the oboe here. And then the flute does something a little different. Let's listen. Very, very simple, pulsating, and then it does it again higher. Alright, before we go on, notice on the flute line, we tailored these dynamics. That's another big part of getting a real sound out of your Ableton orchestra. Because we could just play. If I just play it, don't really remember. That doesn't really have shape. I can't create enough shape using just velocity. I could come in super low. But it's a little bit more difficult because it's a wind instrument, right? If I were like blowing through, like they have some wind controlled MIDI controllers, that would be really cool because I could get the ultimate natural sound. But pushing down on pads isn't really the way to do that. So I tailor the volume, which you can see right here. I try to think of how the flute player would play it, you know, start off soft, build, 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 bring it back down towards the end. Listen to that one more time. And it creates this like breathing effect. And then it fades in here because you wouldn't just blast in. Yeah. Cool. Let me talk about the synth here for a second, because obviously it's really simple. As you can see, it's playing all the same note over and over and over again, but it changes over time. And let's see, the filter is building there, the effects are staying the same. So basically that effect, let's solo it. You see the filter build, but this is an instance where using velocity on pad to our advantage helps, because you can see the velocity build here naturally, and I played that in and then didn't tailor these velocities because I wanted it to be almost like the timpani player is playing the timpanis, and I want it to sound human, like he's actually there playing it. Well, same kind of thing for this synth. I want it to sound like it was being played by a human. So the velocities build, but they're not super like tailored, like stairs going up. Nice. Alright, cool. There's that, there's that. And then you notice a couple things stab in at the end, and those are the pickups. What a pickup is, in case you don't know, is the note that comes in before the phrase, before the one. So it might come in on 4, the end of 4, or just any time before 1, but it's the start of the phrase. It leads into the phrase. And that's really important to add in, because it's very easy in the loop-based system of Ableton to just create all bars that go from beat 1 to all the way through a 4th bar and just like end. They have nice even endings. And that's not really how orchestra music is written. It's not how a lot of music is written. They always have pickups to their phrases. Not everything is starting on a grid. So adding those in is an important part of sounding real. Like in this double bass section. Obviously this is a really light middle section. Not a lot of double bass. No double bass actually. But the double bass is going to come in for this really powerful next section. So we have this little clip right here. That's just the pickup. Just plays a G, which leads right into the first note. You go from G to A. Happens in the French horn as well. There's a pickup here. That tells me something new is going to start. And that's also added on to by these suspended cymbals in the crash. So you can see your suspended cymbal right here. This is Ableton's orchestral mallet suspended cymbal. Really easy. And then it's resolved by a suspended cymbal stick. It's very important to resolve your builds, because it could be very easy to just forget to add that crash there. So here it is without the crash. I have a couple, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Always add your crashes on 1, because you want that tension of the cymbal building. But like the suspended cymbal is essentially the riser of old, right? It's like this building sound that's in the mid to high space. It's sweeping up, and it creates tension all the way up to your drop. So this is essentially the piece's drop, you could say. All very similar elements across different types of genres. Yeah, so that's about it for the mid section. If we want to go on to, I guess what I just called the drop, the main section of the piece, the most dramatic section for sure. Let's give it a shot. So we see these pickups. Something that's been added in this section before we get too far are the toms. Very typical cinematic tom sound. And the way it's achieved is by playing the pattern in. but it's doubled, and if we zoom in really close, you'll see that they're just offset. So what I'm imagining is that 2 to 4 people are going to be playing toms, and since they're humans and they're playing in a real space, usually they're not going to be perfectly aligned, and it makes it sound much more realistic to have a just offset. Or maybe they're on separate sides of the orchestra and just the sound delay is playing with us. So this is what it sounds like by itself. You'll also notice that it's panned all the way to the right, and this second track here is panned to the left to give us that spatial awareness. Much more realistic sounds. Might have killed it there. Let's give it a minute to catch up. But yeah, doubling, I'll do that with toms, I'll do that with crashes. As you can see, that's where my little hidden crash was. It's in the tom section. But even that is a little offset, so imagining that there's more than one person crashing cymbals, and that they're not going to be perfectly in time. The glockenspiel line switched to a crotale. It's very light in the background, but it's there for sure. And then I think I'm going to freeze the piano track, or I'll just freeze the string ensemble since we already talked about it. Yeah, that should help out the CPU. Running OBS and then also trying to run Ableton and all these super CPU heavy instruments can be rough sometimes, so that's where we're at right now. But hope you guys are enjoying the stream. Be sure to add me on the other social media, including Twitter and Instagram. I'm always posting videos. I'm trying to do Instagram stories more as well. I'm always posting photos of the setup on Instagram, which changes daily, as you can kind of see. There's no other monitor here. Let's see if this helped our CPU issue. No, it did not. Let's let it catch up for a bit. Let's talk about what else we added here. So we definitely have a nice low double bass, which super simple line, as you can see. Like, it's not moving a lot. It's changing every bar, hanging over there, and then a pick up to 5. But it's super simple. You don't want to go too heavy with your bass lines. I mean, you don't want to have too much motion in your bass lines unless the harmonic rhythm calls for it. That's also doubled in the tuba, as you can see here. Gives it that nice rock solid foundation, which is the key to like making a super dramatic like drop section. This is a really great stutter effect, but definitely not what I'm trying to go for. Cool. I'll freeze grand piano too, because you never know. And you can see the voice synth is up on the top again. It's a little lighter, but that's really just for atmosphere and for adding like a human, like a real like human sound, you know? Yeah, piano is super intensive. There we go though. You can see the timpani is lining up to every kind of one. It's like kind of building to each one. Not quantized again, just sort of played in, rolled in. Not every roll is the same. Freeze that track as well. Oh, freeze. And you notice that a lot of woodwinds drop out, and I think that's a fault of my own. Like, I tend to use a lot of brass and strings, mostly even just strings. It's a wonder I used a lot of brass in this section anyway. And I guess that's my fault as an orchestrator for not keeping them included. Like, I could definitely have something happening in the clarinet there, but I don't want things to be too oversaturated. I do have some flute, which plays a quicker line on top. the ideal situation would be to have one computer for streaming and then another for Whoa, what happened to our guitar there? Totally out of tune. I'll just take it off for now. So as you can see, you can like barely hear this rhythm. But you know it's there. You know that there's something frantic in the background happening. And I might have to end the stream here because the CPU is definitely not cooperating. But if you have any other questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. We basically got to the bulk of what I wanted to talk about. You want to get your strings a little bit crisper, so you want to heighten up those highs and double some things, but don't double them exactly. Offset them a little bit, especially percussion. Don't quantize unless you absolutely need to. Like obviously a line like this double bass line is quantized because it's very important that it lands on the one. And for the timpani rolls, it's very important where they land too, but you should be able to play them accurate enough that it sounds accurate, but it also sounds human. It doesn't sound rigid. You can't tell that a bass line like this is rigid just because it's playing even quarter notes, right? Even half and whole notes. Let's just play this intro. The intro is basically a reiteration of things that came before, but it's just a way of settling out. I'll unsolo. It's got that voice. That voice is much more prominent in this section. The piano is definitely an iteration of what has happened before, with a slightly different bass line. And there's a little bit more emphasis on the higher notes too. But yeah, that's how I got this cinematic sound. Like I said, this piece was composed to be in solidarity with the protesters at Standing Rock, and if you want to go check out this video on the channel, I'll put it in the link description once the stream is archived. But if you purchase the track, all the proceeds will go to Stand with Standing Rock, and I think it's a super important cause. We won't get too much into it here. But thanks everybody for watching. It's been really great. Be sure to stay in touch on Twitter. It's at Nick TAETRO on Twitter, and TAETRO on Instagram as well for more photos and videos of the setup and tips and tricks. Thank you all so much for watching. Have a good one.